Imagine your car breaks down on a forest road, miles from any signal. No phone, no map, just trees in every direction that all start to look the same. You've seen this scenario 100 times. In movies, in shows, the character always seems to know something. Which way water flows, which plants won't kill you, how to read the ground for signs that someone or something passed through recently. You watch it and think, I would have no idea what I was looking at. Here's the uncomfortable part. Your ancestors would have known. Not the trained survivalist ones. All of them. For over 100,000 years, reading the wilderness like a language wasn't a specialized skill. It was baseline human literacy. You lost access to a language every single one of your ancestors could read fluently. In 1990, a South African researcher named Louis Liebenberg published a theory that sounded almost absurd at first. He argued that tracking, following an animal's footprints through the wild, wasn't just a survival skill. It was the origin of science itself. Here's his reasoning. A skilled tracker doesn't just follow footprints in a straight line. Most of the time, the trail disappears. Hard ground, rocky terrain, rain. At that point, the tracker has to do something remarkable. They form a hypothesis based on the animal's size, its likely behavior, the terrain, the time of day. They predict where the trail should reappear. Then they go check. If they're wrong, they revise the hypothesis and try again. That is, step by step, the scientific method. Liebenberg's argument is that this kind of reasoning, prediction, testing, revision based on physical evidence, may be the oldest form of systematic thinking humans ever developed, long before writing, long before agriculture, possibly over 100,000 years before anyone called it science.
Daniel Lieberman, a Harvard professor of human evolutionary biology, has called this idea original and deeply important. So what did this actually look like in practice? Liebenberg spent years working with sand trackers in the Kalahari Desert. What he documented wasn't guesswork. Skilled trackers could look at a print and determine the species, the sex, the age, sometimes even the specific individual animal that made it. Not from a clear, perfect footprint, from a partial impression, a disturbed patch of sand, a bent blade of grass. When Liebenberg asked sand trackers whether they could recognize the spoor of one specific antelope among a herd, they found the question almost funny. To them, the real mystery was how anyone couldn't do it. This wasn't mystical intuition. It was a dense, structured body of knowledge, built and tested over an entire lifetime, then passed down the same way any technical skill is passed down, through direct teaching, correction, and thousands of hours of supervised practice.
And that's the part that should sound familiar. It's the same fragile transmission chain we've talked about before on this channel. A skill that only survives as long as someone is still alive to teach it. Hand to hand, generation to generation, without a gap long enough to break the chain. For most of the people watching this video, that chain broke a long time ago. It didn't break all at once. As agriculture spread, then cities, then industry, fewer and fewer people needed to read the land to survive. The skill didn't get banned or forgotten on purpose. It just stopped being necessary for daily life, generation after generation, until most descendants of people who could read a footprint like a sentence couldn't identify a single animal track in their own backyard. Here's the part that makes this different from some of our other stories, though. This isn't a language with only one speaker left. This isn't a skill preserved only in old documents no one can fully interpret anymore. It's still alive, right now, in the hands of people still practicing it every day. Sand trackers in the Kalahari and Hadza hunters in Tanzania still read the ground the way their ancestors did. And in 2023, something remarkable happened that shows exactly what that skill is still worth. Paleontologists working on South Africa's Cape South coast had been studying fossilized animal tracks preserved in ancient rock, some dating back to the Pleistocene, tens of thousands of years old. Reading these fossil tracks with standard scientific methods is slow and often inconclusive, so the researchers did something unusual. They brought in master trackers from the Juhoansi sand community and simply asked them to read the fossils the way they'd read tracks in sand. The trackers identified species, sexes, and even specific behaviors in the fossilized prints with a level of detail the paleontologists hadn't been able to extract on their own. Ancient, undocumented knowledge, still functioning at full strength, was suddenly doing real scientific work in a modern research lab. The people carrying this skill weren't being consulted as a cultural curiosity. They were being consulted because they were, quite literally, better at reading the evidence than anyone else in the room.
And this isn't only happening in Africa. It's closer to home than you think. In the United States, search and rescue teams still train in a discipline called man tracking, reading footprints, disturbed soil, broken twigs, and bent grass to find a missing hiker or a lost child before it's too late. The National Association for Search and Rescue treats it as a core skill, not a novelty. In the late 1960s, mountain rescue teams partnered directly with the U.S. Border Patrol to formalize modern tracking training for search and rescue work, adapting techniques that trace straight back to the same tradition Liebenberg studied in the Kalahari. Police departments use it too. Officers trained in tracking have testified in court about a suspect's direction of travel based on footprint analysis alone. Evidence a camera or a database could never have produced. None of these trackers are reading the land for the origin of science. They're reading it because right now, in a national park or a rural county somewhere in America, it might be the fastest way to bring someone home alive. The skill didn't stay in the past. It just moved into the places where it still mattered enough to keep teaching it. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. If this knowledge still exists, and it's this valuable, why does it feel like something from a different world to almost everyone watching this? Because the chain that keeps a skill like this alive only stays intact where it's still needed. In most of the modern world, it simply isn't anymore. You don't need to read a disturbed patch of grass when a delivery app can find your location down to the meter. You don't need to predict an animal's likely path when your food arrives in shrink-wrapped plastic. The skill didn't get taken from you. It just stopped being useful long enough for long enough generations that nobody thought to teach it to the next one. But here's what's worth sitting with. Somewhere in the world right now, there are still people who can look at the ground you're standing on and read a story you'd never even notice was there. Not as a performance, not as folklore, as a working, testable, teachable form of knowledge, old enough to have been the first science humans ever practiced, and precise enough that professional researchers and search and rescue teams a few states away from you are still relying on it today. You didn't lose the capacity for it. Every human brain is still built for this kind of reasoning. What you lost was the chain, the specific, unbroken line of teaching that turns that raw capacity into an actual skill. The forest is still out there, still full of information. Somewhere, someone can still read it. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this made you think differently about something you thought you already understood, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe to Vanished Knowledge, and I'll see you in the next one.